So like a medium-term vision is, if you're a company or you're a country, you have a budget to balance and you have a balance sheet to report your assets and your liabilities, how much money you made, how much money you spent. I think you can take that same discipline of accounting when you can now measure nature and your impact on nature for having a natural capital balance sheet, how much assets you accrue and how much you spend.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Robbie Schingler, co-founder of Planet Labs. In this discussion, we talk about what is Planet and what it means to be a public benefit corporation while also being publicly traded. We go into the tools and services that Planet offers and why they're so important for addressing the ecological crisis. Robbie shares a clear vision for how companies can move beyond only having a financial balance sheet to also having a natural capital balance sheet. Robbie offers a fun idea for what comes next after the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also go into nature debt swaps, which can be absolutely huge, and the crucial role that philanthropy can contribute. Throughout this discussion, we talk about the risks of commodifying nature and other possible unintended consequences as we undergo these economic transitions. And finally, I ask Robbie about his interest and engagement in New Zealand. Ultimately, this is a discussion exploring how do we create a just and regenerative economy. This was one of my favorite conversations from all of season 1. It was recorded in April 2023 at the Eco Weaving Gathering. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Robbie Schingler. Welcome. We are here with Robbie Schingler. Robbie is the co-founder of Planet. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
And let's hear, what is Planet?
What is Planet? Planet is building an Earth data platform. And this is to allow for companies and software developers to build real-time decision tools based on facts about the planet. And in order to do that, we started about 11 years ago, and we started from the space segment. So we built satellites, all in-house, hundreds of them, in order to come up with a unique information feed to image the entire land area of the Earth every day. And we've been doing that for 6 years now. And so now we built all these tools on it to allow for developers and data scientists to then query the planet. So one of the visions that we have for it is to really build out an ecosystem of software developers that use an Earth query language, not a structured query language, not SQL, but EQL, in order to query the planet, in order to then power these real-time decision support tools across just about every single sector on the planet, from agriculture to forestry to civil government, defense and intelligence, for nonprofits, for students, and also for media.
Awesome. And we had a great conversation with your co-founder, Will Marshall, about really the state of the planet and some of the ways that Planet plugs in. People can watch that. I'm curious, which types of use cases you get really excited about, because it does seem like once you really immerse yourself into understanding images of the Earth, it is relevant for so many different domains. But what gets you most pumped?
Well, one of my favorite partnerships is something that we do with the Norwegian government. So Norway, they've, for the last 20 plus years, they really supported the United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization for the REDD Plus program, reducing the emissions of degradation and deforestation. And as we know today, we really haven't turned the tide of how we manage our forests and land use. So there hasn't been that much progress over the last 20 years, and they put billions into this. When we started the company, we always had a bit of a reference use case and something that has a public benefit associated with it. And this was really to be able to zoom in far enough with our satellites to count every tree on the planet. And then if you can do that every day, then you can see how it's changing over time. So we actually went to Norway early on to be like, hey, do you want to invest in our company? While it didn't work out in investment, we ended up partnering together. So we've created a special license to get access to the tropical countries around the world. They can all have access to a cloud-free monthly picture of the world's forests for them to better manage them. We've been doing that for 3 years now. And that use case, I think, is really quite, I'm very proud of, because the amount of adoption of new national parks, getting everybody on a common operating picture, instead of having 64 countries come up with their own measuring, reporting, and verification tools. These can now all be a common picture. Every month, you can see that change over time. And then you can do something about it. So really the deforestation one is one of my favorite use cases, but that's to stop something bad from happening. But really the power of an Earth Data platform is to not just stop the bad, but is to actually shift your behavior toward a more regenerative activity, something that public policy can shift what they actually do to incentivize the behavior of markets, and what businesses can do when, for instance, the European Commission just released a policy back in December for deforestation-free commodities being imported into Europe. That needs to be proven by the world's largest companies. And so being able to manage your supply chain. So that one use case can go proliferate all the way through what happens when you have a real-time access to information about the entire planet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like there's a theme here of common shared language, the EQL. And I'm curious, so as a public corporate company, how do you, but also just deeply rooted in the DNA of technology and research and academia and the roots at NASA, how do you set standards and create common shared languages in that kind of environment where there's private profit interests and so forth?
Well, there's a lot in there, and we can unpack it. One is standards, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the first is being a public for-profit company that, in my opinion, has a tremendous amount of public benefit inside of our organization. And honestly, that's what we need over the course of the 21st century is for companies to be thinking about the public benefit in the goods and services that they provide. No longer is this in the Web 2.0 days where you're a neutral platform company and you can be hands off around what people do with your technology. I think it's incumbent upon everyone within an organization, but all the way at the top, from the leadership team, but then to product managers and software engineers and developers and technologists, is to be intentional around what is the impact of your product on society. When I mentioned before, our company is about 11 years old. We went public about a year ago, and we went public under a new corporate form that's called a public benefit corporation. Super cool. It's using more of the social technologies that exist that any entrepreneur should be thinking about, social technologies and hard technologies, when they put it together to build something of consequence. And so this corporate form is a public benefit corporation. Back when I went to business school a while ago, corporate social responsibility was kind of like the thing in social entrepreneurship. And that really kind of stayed in the marketing department, and it was kind of greenwashing, and it didn't really kind of get into what the business model is of the organization or the product principles for what the business actually gives into the world. But I think that there's a whole new wave of companies today that recognize that we need new solutions in order to transition the economy to a regenerative economy and to take responsibility for the effect of your product on society. And this corporate form allows for me as a director and officer in the company to be legally liable for our stakeholders, not just shareholders, but also our public benefit purpose. So we need to make decisions based on the products that we create, how we go to market for all stakeholders and not just for shareholder value. And I think that is that's something that I'm super excited about, that I want any entrepreneur to be thinking about when they actually start their own business is, what is the intended consequence that you're going to have on society with the product that you actually create? And then to not just talk about it, but put that into your product principles, put that into your corporate charter, and hold yourself accountable to that. You have a North Star, something big that you want to bring into the world. It's something that the entire team rallies around, and it's not a straight line, but you never lose your course when you are a mission-driven company.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's not about maybe the early versions of this, which tended to be stamps on the side of the label that tried to signal some sort of virtue or some sort of higher purpose, well-intended or not. They often were flimsy or thin. You're saying, by really getting all the way to the level of the constitution of the corporation,
exactly,
declaring it as a public benefit corporation and going public, which, marrying those two things together is no small task, I'm sure. How do you operationalize this? And talk me through even more, like, where does it show up in the company? And what are some of the operational decisions that you've made and continue to learn about how to bring these principles and this ethic forward?
Yeah, I think we were fortunate because we started our company thinking about the public benefit first. We initially took venture capital money because it was high risk that we were doing. We were doing something that just did not exist before in aerospace to dramatically disrupt the cost performance metric of satellites. And so we actually first went to foundations, but they couldn't take the technical risk. So we did it as a convertible note. And the Hail Mary was actually go to Norway or the Moore Foundations, where we also went to, which is pay back the $3 million, give us 20, and we'll build this public benefit. And it turns out we've raised over $1 billion. So, that was me being a NASA physicist and engineer, not really understanding like how much work there is to do on the product side, on the sales side, the customer support side, the everything in order to build a generational organization.
Right. You guys have like over 1,000 people now.
Now we have over 1,000 people, exactly. But at least for us, that was our DNA from the very beginning. Was use space to help life. You've talked to Will before, and I've known Will for over 20 years. We've collaborated on many projects together, and we've, our side projects turned into main projects, and they were always about trying to steer humanity toward a more sustainable humanity, a more just humanity, and seeking truth and wisdom and understanding, whether it's in policy stuff or in this case, actually a purpose-driven company. So as we've grown, we articulated our values, and our values are shared agreements with the team. It wasn't just written down to say, here's how we behave. It was actually written down like maybe 3 years into our company, which is like, here are our values that mean something to us. And we were really cognizant about the convergence of these technologies and its potential impact on society. So, one thing that we did was we started an ethics committee even before we launched our first satellite. and we still have an ethics committee. It's now in its like probably fourth generation. And that group of people, it's all made up of different people within the company. Anyone can put up their hand and do a 2-year tour on it. It's not a full-time job, but it spikes when things actually happen. And that group is an advisory body for our leadership team. So we haven't quite given them power or veto power or anything, because I believe that like actually that is the role of the leadership team is to make those decisions. But it is a group that is thinking about 2 years into the future and the precedent that's set for what we do today. And anyone in the company can essentially raise a flag to say, hey, I want this to go to the ethics committee. And the ethics committee does their deliberative process, and if they don't have their own case studies that they've already done before, and it's something that they want the leadership team to know, they'll bring it to the leadership team. And then we'll deliberate, and ultimately, Will, our CEO, makes the call if we have to actually make a call. But that level of kind of internal governance is very useful, because it allows for everyone in the company to know that it's their responsibility to raise a flag if they see something, and to catch something relatively early on, because this level of transparency that we're bringing out to the world has consequences, both positively and potentially negatively. And so we need to really take responsibility for the effect of our product on society. So we really do internalize that into our organization. But ultimately, the best way that we do it, not just with values, which are shared agreements for every employee, and our employee to be able to raise a flag anonymously in order for us to deliberate on something, is to create our products that already think about the second or the third order consequence on society, so that we avoid getting into things that we're not ready for yet. Whether it's personal privacy, so nothing we do actually gets into personally identifiable information, or things that are too close to a state's national security. So that's why we chose for our first mission to count every tree on the planet. It's something that had tremendous public benefit. There's a lot of commercial potential, and it doesn't actually change too much of one's national security. So that Venn diagram overlap is something that we bake into every new mission that we build, because we're bringing out a new sense for the planet, for us to understand what's happening on our planet.
Fascinating. What keeps you up at night in terms of potentially unintended consequences?
Well, I think what keeps me up at night is what users can do to manipulate the data, deep fakes for satellite imagery. And that's just part of the vitriol that the reality.
Oh, look, Russia's moving troops
Exactly.
into but actually faking the images.
But taking imagery and faking it around and attributing it back, attributed back to Planet would not be good. Because there's so much trust that we built up with our customers and with the public, but then also just to add to the misinformation on the planet. We actually want to quell that with baselines of facts that then allow for reasonable people to disagree or argue or debate on top of that, instead of currently what the public discourse is. So that's something that does keep me up at night is the misuse or misrepresentation and the faking of facts that come from the planet. I think we've seen we all know about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there are civil wars and conflicts that are happening all over the world that do not get that level of attention. And that's something that's in some cases, like typically when a new technology becomes available, it is those who have more power who get access to it first, especially in a local conflict or a civil war conflict. that isn't necessarily good to give some people access to information other people not. And so that's been a number of things that have come up through our ethics committee, and we've chosen not to engage with people. And they reach out to a number of experts in think tanks and academic organizations who really understand the geopolitical context around some of these regions that we operate in, because we're global. We capture one picture of the whole Earth every day. So it's the power asymmetry is something that also keeps me up at night. But then the flip side of that is also an opportunity. Right? Like when we know what's coming down the pipe with respect to new products and technology, and how can you align a go-to-market where those who are the most vulnerable or don't have the most amount of power in our current economic system, how can they get most value first?
Right.
So that it then becomes more equalizing and more equitable. That's something that gives me a lot of hope, which is the flip side of the coin of kind of status quo, the way that things are today.
Yeah, and it seems like in that lens, even though you can sell to a lot of different types of customers and buyers and sectors, you've chosen to focus a lot on the climate crisis, the ecological crisis as an area where you want to put your technology to good use. Obviously counting every tree as your first act is a demonstration of that. Yeah. What else are you sensing as opportunities for contributing to conservation, protection, regenerative agriculture, et cetera?
Yeah, well, with the core product that we have today of imaging the whole world every day, that reference use case was to count every tree on the planet, which forests are about 25% of the land area. And if you can zoom into every tree, that's actually zooming in quite a bit to every crop on the planet. And so that's also another 25% of the land area of the Earth. And being able to get that update regularly, like every day, or in cloudy regions, you get a clear picture every week. That's just an unprecedented level of information that people.
And what is that information? It's not just like, oh, there's trees there, oh, there's a crop there. Like, you're going much deeper than that.
Yeah. So some of our users, they know how to use the raw pictures, and that was our go-to-market. But today we have these information feeds that are much more specific. So how much soil moisture is there? So you don't have to look at pictures. You can essentially just look at a graph. What's the surface temperature of the land? And that's very useful for hotspots and urban planning, also in agriculture. We have the ability to extract out every road and every building on the planet, right? So the built environment, where assets are. It's very useful for a number of applications in insurance and civil government. And then also on the tree example is, understand your canopy structure and the amount of carbon that's in a tree. And so that is something that, we've been prototyping in the academic community quite a bit and really supporting that community to come up with standards. Back to the point around standards, how are those created? They're created by the actors, where people can, use the best rigorous science and different types of approaches, publish their methodology, debate on it, make it better, and then come up with something that is, yes, this is an empirical measurement of carbon in trees, and it's allometry. The height of a tree and the structure of it. You can come up with a really, really accurate metric of the amount of carbon that's stored in a tree. And that's something that we chose to do an acquisition earlier this year. Awesome science-driven team, all focused on forestry, to scale a pilot that they've done for forest carbon, but for the entire world. So by the end of next year, that will be a new data feed that then people don't have to mess with all the pictures. I mean, we get like 4 million unique pictures a day and have to process all of that data, about 35 terabytes of raw compressed data to then get it all the way to this, what we call a planetary variable. And that's the pivot point to then allow developers to just query through that. And they can suck up the answers to what they're actually looking for.
Hmm.
So the forest carbon is something I'm super excited about. Again, on the side of positivity around like the vector of progress around where we're going, needing to evolve from an extractive economy, an industrial economy on top of an extractive economy into a regenerative economy where we are aware of the natural resources that we use within the products and services that we build and consume so that you could actually, so that we can get more toward a circular economy or a regenerative economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me like one of the, defining aspects of Planet is this, that you're taking pictures every day. And so that you have this steady, consistent information availability of change over time, because what that creates is the feedback loop or the information, the data to be able to track before, after types of changes, which is the kind of holy grail key missing piece of information we need in so many of our ecological coordination systems. Say like, well, you said you were going to do this regenerative ag practice. Did you do it or did you not?
Yep.
You said you were going to plant those trees. You said you weren't going to cut those trees down. You said you were going to restore that water catchment. Like, how do we get ground truth, impartial, objective information over time from a trusted actor, literally the satellites in space, to make those types of assessments? And of course, this fits into a lot of the themes we've been discussing in this interview series around Web3, blockchain, climate finance, carbon markets, different types of eco-credits. It's like that hinges on the ability to have good data oracles and good information feedback mechanisms. So how are you thinking about all of this? And
well, I want to add another persona to it, because you're talking almost about like, you said you would, more from a compliance standpoint, you said you would do this. Did you do that? Now think about it. If you are inside the government and you're in an ag department and you're sending out incentives, right now they're measured with money out the door, not really kind of outcome-based programs. So like governments can be, getting that feedback loop so that they can say, hey, we're going to pilot and prototype this. And you can actually see really quickly, is it having the impact that you want before you then tool up into a program? Same if you're an agroforester. It's like, okay, you can get, an alert that the crop is not performing as well in the southeastern corner, and you can go reprioritize your day and find out that something happened. There's blight there. Then you can do it. You get alerted, and you can actually change your behavior prior to losing your entire crop. So it's not just from a compliance standpoint. I think there are many different personas that could actually use this. Okay, so with respect to how this fits in with the series, though, I think it's one building block, which is just assuming you have an Earth data platform and it's trusted and it's factual, right? You can almost suspend disbelief around the need for an MRB tool, because if you get a time series of stuff every day, that is a measuring, reporting, and verification tool. So it's like a utility. It's a planetary utility as a building block that is part of how we shift toward allowing for the market to see the value of natural capital. And, we are, as a global community, we've been talking about global warming and 1.5 or 2 degree world. It's so ephemeral. It's so far away. It's something that's planetary. It's hard for that to actually change my behavior as an individual. But, the empirical evidence is there. And I think that the Overton window of, is this real or is this not, has shifted over the last 15 years, which is a good thing. So we're now more aware of the problem. And that's really based on historical science data that's been collected with forecast and modeling. And we're learning now that our forecast has been too optimistic. It's actually worse than what had been forecasted. To get toward action, you do need that frequent update. It has to impact me as a farmer, it has to impact me as a commodity buyer, or me as a program officer in a government agency, in order to use that real-time information to then make sure that the impact of what I'm doing is actually most beneficial. Mm-hmm. So we now know that the Overton window has shifted. We know that that climate change is occurring. Our focus right now is on carbon, and that is not everything by any means, but there is a lot of commitment and methodologies and a community that I think that is the kernel of a solution to get more toward a regenerative economy. And then we hope to play our role of being that empirical data feed around accurate, reliable metrics of carbon stored in trees. And then the science community will continue to innovate around a standard for soil carbon, mm-hmm. right? And then the science community will innovate around a standard on top of biodiversity markers. Mm-hmm. And then that's how we shift this, not just for carbon, but you unbundle the co-benefits of ecosystem services, because particular biomes play a particular play a particular role within the overall ecosystem that we have. Mm-hmm. But yeah, these enabling technologies are here right now. These are building blocks. And I think the opportunity that we have is also on the Web3 space, which you're an expert in way more than I am, but I love it because it is it also is a utility. It's relatively inexpensive to have all of a sudden get rent seekers out of a supply chain and make it a way more efficient economy, from a buyer all the way down to the seller, an agroforester on the ground. If you think about it, if we can see our planet and you overlay GDP, and then you see our planet and you overlay natural capital, that's a huge equalizing shift for the global economy. Because the services that we get out of intact and healthy ecosystems for fresh water and for clean air is part of it needs to be seen, because our current extractive methodologies are having this massive impact. And the sad part is that there's, even if we stop today and change our behavior today, there's going to be a delay. So it's going to be tough over the next 10 to 20 years while we then shift our behavior. But we have to shift our behavior beforehand in order to then get toward a more regenerative economy.
Yeah, our economy and nature are already intertwined. We already value a forest, but we only value it for the extraction.
Right, the wood that's cut down.
It's wood, yeah. Right? And we don't have a way to value it on the basis of being intact. And so, it seems like a lot of the discussions I've been having, we're all feeling this tension of not wanting to put a price on the forest because it doesn't feel consistent with valuing just the intrinsic nature of it. Yeah. And it is impossible to put a price on life, and somewhat implies that if someone will pay more than that price, then they can cut it down or do whatever they want with it and so forth. And so we have this kind of like gut level ethical kind of, I don't know about this, like continuing to atomize and financialize and commodify nature. And yet, like, I'm looking at those trees behind you, like those trees produce tremendous value, and we need to somehow it's not that we need to change what nature is doing. We need to change our economic system to be better aligned. How are you feeling this discussion and experiencing those considerations?
I mean, I think that we have to learn how to unsee a little bit. I'm a physicist. I'm trained in the Descartesian worldview of reductionist approach towards solving massive systems engineering challenges. And, we built up the modern world in that way with all of its benefits, but we also now see all of its shadow sides. And And so I think part of coming up with some of these solutions is don't know the answer. I think it's important to think about the second and the third order consequences, and then to shift if you actually are producing way more or more harm than good, or like orders of magnitude, or it should be like orders of magnitude more good than harm. But if we back up, we have a financialized economic system that doesn't see nature. So that could become natural capital. But that's not all of the value of nature, right? It's life, it's wisdom, it's relational. And that's something that I think is like a third bucket that is, that we should not put a price on. But without exploring and being intentional around making companies and countries see the value of nature instead of what you can extract from it, it's a way less desirable future. So bringing natural capital into the global economy is the best approach that I think that this community is taking with intentionality, to not give up the sacred or the value of life. Because you can value natural capital doesn't mean that that's all the value that you have in nature. So, if I think about the, more of a capitalistic economy and growth mindset, I think if you create put nature around that as a bit of a control function, you can still have that growth mindset within a regenerative economy. It just changes how you design things. If all of a sudden you have a true cost, the water that you use, the natural resources that you use, the transportation through your supply chain, what your users do with it, how it's recycled back into the next thing, that will allow for innovation to happen within a more traditional capitalistic approach and a growth mindset.
And you're talking about true cost accounting.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that, and for people who might not be as familiar with it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's based on what we can see today, and we'll get it wrong, and we'll get it wrong for the next couple of generations. Then we'll see more things that we have to actually change it again. But again, that's the benefit of these social technologies that we have of law. And laws are what make up, the rules of the game for a market. So these are adaptable over time. So like a medium-term vision is to, if you're a company or you're a country, you have a budget to balance, and you have a balance sheet to report your assets and your liabilities, how much money you made, how much money you spent. I think you can take that same discipline of accounting when you can now measure nature and your impact on nature, for having a natural capital balance sheet, how much assets you accrue and how much you spend, right? And so imagine if you're a farmer and you do monocrop, ag, and you sell your commodity product. And without the natural capital balance sheet, you're just there to just increase production and put artificial fertilizer on it, and not accounting for your supply chain or your impact on the environment and the erosion of topsoil that's happening. If we can see and account for the natural capital side of things, it makes it more financially logical for that farmer to shift to regenerative ag, where maybe their yield comes down, but they start to accrue more natural capital, more carbon stored in the soil, less emissions of runoff in the rivers, less pollution, less utilization of fossil fuel nitrates that they put on. So you decrease your yield a little bit, but then you increase your natural capital. So that's when we get into the incentive structures where people shift how they actually do land use management, and they shift how they produce their agroforestry product. And you get more toward a regenerative approach to utilizing these assets. But that exists. I could think, say you're, an IT company, and you really you're not accruing a lot of natural capital, but you can measure the effects of your emissions, and you can measure, the impact that you're having with how your employees, commute into work, and the flights that you do, and the goods that are in your supply chain. Those are all liabilities on your natural capital balance sheet. And right now, some of the biggest companies in the world, they're saying we're carbon neutral, and they buy on the voluntary market some carbon credits. A lot of them are saying we will be, net zero in 2030 or 2045 or 20 whatever. And there actually aren't really good pathways to get there. There isn't really a strategic plan along the way to do that in a way that is really quite sustainable and regenerative. In the voluntary markets, then, now imagine that you're that farmer, but you're not in Iowa, you're in Bolivia. And you only know how to practice regenerative agriculture. And on your natural capital balance sheet, you have a lot of natural capital. It's just not seen in the financial market. Using blockchain tech, you can have a big IT company on the west coast of the United States that then gets that buys natural capital assets from that farmer in Bolivia. And you all of a sudden, as the farmer in Bolivia, have a new asset that you can sell every single year. So getting toward retirement of natural capital every single year, just like you need to balance your books every single year in order to pay taxes, that's where I see an interim state coming in, where you have your financial balance sheet and your natural capital balance sheet.
Yeah, I think it's, I really want to underline and underscore it. The way you've articulated it to me in this manner, has really stuck with me. And I think it reflects your inputs coming from so many different sectors, and understanding the compliance standards that are emerging, the commitments that are happening, the ways that, companies and large companies and public companies have to manage their accounting, where the technologies are. So I just feel like you have synthesized this into this very simple, distilled vision that to me resonates strongly. And so I'm just want to linger on the point so that people really hear it, which is this idea of at the end of the financial year, I go through and I work with my accountant, and I have to come up with some sort of reconciliation to pay my taxes. That's exactly right. And as we instrumentalize and collect more information and data about the impact of what you could do it at a personal level, but let's use it at business, about my business, about the supply chain, about, or as a farmer, about the use of pesticides and herbicides, or, all of these different types of natural assets, carbon, biodiversity, water, et cetera. I get to the end of my fiscal year and I need to reconcile the books. I need to shore them up. And maybe I'm an airline and I've used a lot of carbon, or maybe I'm a farmer and I've built a lot of carbon. But what we're building is markets that can connect, so that it's very simple to buy the deficits, the credits, the deficits that I have, in order to get back in harmony and balance. Because we have to recognize that it's everyone and every institution has some sort of impact on nature, and it's not always going to be 100% in balance in and of itself. It's not like, the airline is going to sequester a bunch of carbon itself. It's going to rely on the people planting trees and managing forests and drawing carbon down into the soil for that. So there has to be a relationship between the airline and the farmer or the forest, right? And so those relationships are essentially facilitated by markets and governed by the laws that are implemented towards this kind of natural asset, natural capital accounting. And it fits very much within the zeitgeist of what seems to be emerging with SEC rules
Yep.
and Scope 3 and all these different kind of rules that to me feels like it's starting from very large institutions and businesses and working its way down. Now, I'll give you a space, and then I want to ask a few other sub-bullet point questions, but how do you feel about that articulation?
I mean, you're more or less saying that, accountants are going to save the world. But and in
but
some
I'm also
cases,
saying that Web3 is going to change the accountant's
it's going to make
job.
it possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we know that from AI. It's not AI going to take your jobs. It's humans with AIs that will take your jobs, and the white collar jobs, like the accountants' jobs that are there. So absolutely, there's tech in there to make this super efficient and accessible. But it's being pragmatic around how the world operates. And now just think about it, another lens that I like to take a look at the different actors within society is like, over what time frame do they make decisions? And what's their, what is their incentive structure? So, or what's their business model? You're a nonprofit, you still have a business model, company, a business model. Now think about it, if you're one of the big four accounting firms that are out there. Rarely will a transition happen that you can all of a sudden double your addressable market. And just using that lens of a financialized reason for them to make this shift can help them to actually be part of accelerating that transition. And auditors and accountants, they're trusted. They're trusted by companies, they're trusted by markets, they're trusted by governments. So, working with the auditors in order to actually show how you can measure this in an empirical way and audit this is, I think, a key ingredient for how quickly we can shift to a regenerative economy. So they're absolutely critical. I also think the big companies, while we're talking about it from that standpoint, they have so much market power. The way that if you're a consumer packaged good company, the amount of commodity products that are inside your consumer packaged goods that you sell, they have a global supply chain. And choosing to shift more toward regenerative practices or deforestation-free commodities like the European Union legislation, that has a huge impact on the global supply chain, on the global market. Then all of a sudden it can be like, I'm a farmer, not doing regenerative stuff, and I just lost my big, huge deal with Nestle. And they went to my neighbor who's doing regenerative ag. I need to actually shift, right? So I think taking a look at the business model or the incentive structure that's in place, we can use exactly the system that we have today to just hijack it and adapt it to see more of what we do value as humans, but then have that reflected more into markets.
Right. Okay, so I want to poke like the criticisms. I mean, I think one criticism is that we're never going to be able to address kind of the full scale and scope of all of the impacts on nature from our activities, especially with like a large scale organization. What do you think of that?
I think it's true, but I think that there's a lot more that we can that we can do today that we know is the right thing to do, that we don't have the micro incentives to shift our behavior. So, or big incentives.
Right.
And the biggest incentive is new market opportunity, like I was saying for the auditors. But to my point around like the relational equity or relational value, or like what, the true beauty and wisdom of nature, like that's not gonna come in.
But even beyond that, like I think we have a bit of a schizophrenic relationship in society with Tesla, for example, in the environmental space, where on the one hand, great, bringing renewable energy, renewable cars, electrifying, and on the other hand, like, wait, there's consequence to all of those mines, and there's consequence to lithium, and we don't seem to have like some kumbaya common understanding of what are the resourcing trade-offs and so forth, even in such kind of a simple example, relatively speaking, like it's in the domain of the subject matter. So even beyond the question of like valuing the sacred, like how do we even expect that every large scale Fortune 1000 company is going to somehow be able to understand with real intelligence all of the inputs and all of the, like Walmart with all of its products and all, like,
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to be careful of the dependency pathways that we're actually creating with transitions, and are you perpetuating still something that is that will then be around for another 100 years, right? So we have to be super mindful of that. When you design a product for a circular economy, for a regenerative economy, you are thinking about all of the inputs and all of the outputs, and to make it fully more as recyclable as you can get. And I think that like there's just so much low hanging fruit that we have today that it's worth that we have to move on it. Like the crisis is here, it's among us, and I think that we will get a number of things not 100% accurate, and that then we have to do better next time, and the next generation, and the next generation, as we're able to see more and understand more, especially the interrelation between these things. I think it's like a pursuit of a true cost economy. I don't know if you can ever actually get to a true cost economy.
Right.
And that's why I do like the term of this middle kind of vision of a financial balance sheet and a natural capital balance sheet, and for that to be part of a regenerative economy.
Yeah, I agree. I think it doesn't need to be that we solve 100% of the footprint of a large scale business in order to get to an improvement on being able to introduce and bring in natural capital accounting. Like we can build it incrementally. And like every incremental bit is an improvement, because then we're recognizing where are we externalizing our outputs onto nature, and to start taking responsibility for that, and to effectively pay for our impact on the commons pool resources. Okay, the other critique that I feel is, even more possibly like poignant is, so if I get to the end of my fiscal year and I'm like, okay, I've got my natural capital accounting reconciliation process, and I used, a lot more water, and so I need to buy some water credits. And then I open up my, whatever Bloomberg terminal-esque interface of buying water credits from some, faceless, nameless marketplace, that, I'm actually having like ramifications on some farm in India. And we've seen in the commodity markets that as soon as you commodify these types of natural assets, you also end up with, I hesitate to use the word speculators, but that's what they're often called. But really, it's investors and the whole world of people in the financial apparatus who are then bidding things up and down and looking at next season and kind of trying to make predictions and so forth. And I guess there's one belief system that all builds this beautiful, efficient market. But there's, I think, a lot of well-evidenced pushback that suggests that actually that kind of financialization and commodification is causing enormous amounts of unintended consequences, usually at the disadvantage of those who can afford it the least. So bringing more of nature into this system feels like it could be highly problematic. How do you think about this?
I am very much concerned with what I believe is the right way forward because of what we've done with financial markets, right? To your point, where money has just made money on top of money, and the real wage growth over the last 40 years has really gone to the rich and not the middle class, at least in the West. So that's a major challenge, and that's where tax policy comes in. That's where regulatory comes in order to actually shape the values. I mean, I think taxation is a reflection of people's values in democracies. And that's a whole body of work that I don't know nearly enough about. But to your point around commodification of it, and to get away from speculation, most of the early carbon credits were really kind of project based, saying, hey, put in this amount of money and here's the amount of carbon that you're going to be able to do every single year, and you buy those futures essentially. And that was probably the best that we could do at that point in time. But we didn't have good measurement systems. There were double counting. You couldn't actually do compliance against it. There was no auditing against it. There were no third-party auditors. The incentives weren't there for people on the ground to actually continue to do that. So I almost would wipe that away and just think, okay, no speculation into the future. Like for a company, you retire it when you buy it.
Right.
And so that means that, you're a big company on the West Coast of the United States. You buy a whole bunch of carbon credits directly from 1,000 different smallholder farmers, and it's retired that year. That means that they're incented to keep those forests intact for the next year, because then they can sell the same thing again and again. So that's a really simplified mental model, but you can imagine how that would scale.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that, what I don't like about the idea of bundling things as a commodity is that you tend to think of like a commodity like a bushel of corn or a barrel of oil. But like when you actually look at the true environmental costs of oil that comes from Venezuela or oil that comes from Saudi Arabia, it's like 80 times cleaner in Saudi Arabia than it's Venezuela. But our global markets put them all actually together. So, and we want to incentivize even when we are using extractive stuff, because we will. Like oil is used in a lot of things. There are a lot of alternatives that can actually shift the amount of petrochemical that we have in our economy. We still will have some extractive mines and minerals and so forth. That you want it to be those that are most that are least impacted on the environment to be the ones that actually can survive financially. Yeah, if we unbundle those things, and we've started to do that in food, we call it organic versus not, but like there isn't that level of providence that goes all the way down to actually know, is this done with good working conditions? Is this, having negative, are you impacting your waterways based on it? We don't know that as consumers. And I do think that's a potential of having that level of transparency with digitizing these things and making it accessible from the consumer all the way down to where it came from and the producer, that can breed a level of like conscious consumption. And that's possible with these two technologies, an Earth Data Platform and some of these Web3 tech.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that Gregory Landue speaks well to from Regen Network, and we had an interview with him as well about, the goal being that we can really be able to drill down, if we are going to say like a carbon credit, that, you're going to be able to open up for Web3 people, the equivalent of Etherscan, a kind of an explorer, and actually get to very precise information instantaneously about where was it originated, what was the methodology, who governed it, what were the trail of decisions made, and so forth. And if we can build these eco-service credit markets on the blockchain with that starting architecture, rather than, okay, let's hurry up and aggregate a bunch of carbon credits, tokenize them, and then that way people can speculate on the future value of carbon credits, which kind of gets to that issue about, resaleability rather than retirability. Those are two very different worlds. And I would say that people who are thinking about this in the Web3 context, like both of those worlds are happening right now in these Web3 conversations, and need to be nuanced accordingly.
Yep. And I think that we need to move fast, but we also need to. It's worth starting correctly with the right type of principles around how you're designing this incentive structure. That's all that an economic system actually is, and it should really be about health and well-being of people on the planet at the core and fundamental. And that's why I'm an advocate to start for this like retirement right away, especially in the voluntary space. Back to what Gregory is doing. One of the things that I would care a lot about too is like who owns the land. Is it a big huge company? Is it a small holder, or is it in a land trust? Right, that actually land owns itself. And I think that the credit value of that should be different based on, who's benefiting from this. Right. And having humans be in relation with nature, and being stewards of it. I would personally, if I had that level of traceability in it, that's where I would choose to go. Right. And then if that happens, if you're a farmer, you need to own the land. You need to steward the land. You can get paid more by actually like not owning the land, but stewarding the land, but it's still the same. Like that is a very, you can use markets to incentivize the behavior that we're actually looking for. I love that level of transparency. It is a hard thing to do. Yeah. And I think that we're not going to get it 100% right out of the gate. I think we should have, dozens of projects around the world of various sizes that we should be watching and measuring and getting a little, using our science brain against it to find out what are these rules of a regenerative economy. Yeah. If I can, hyperstition like a future, I would love for, or we are like halfway through the sustainable development goals, right? From 2015 to 2030. And we need to start thinking about what is the next 15-year goals. And I'd love for those to be the regenerative development goals, right? Where nature is actually part of the incentive structure that we have in place, recognizing how important that is for life on the planet. And there's and I think we did a much better job with the SDGs than we did with the Millennium Development Goals from 2015, where there were no metrics associated with it. It was just kind of like put out there as targets, but no accountability and no way to actually change your programs. And the SDGs did much better and started coming up with all these indicators underneath it, almost post facto, some of which the indicators you couldn't measure against, so you couldn't do policy programs around and be held accountable with. I think for the regen development goals, we should start with those metrics around what it is that we can measure, and then bubble them up to the high-level dashboard, so that policymakers and program officers and government agencies and companies are able to manage what they're responsible for. And that means we have to actually start, in a couple of years, as a community, to come up with what are those metrics, what is that dashboard, then what are those regen development goals.
Yeah, love it. If anyone's going to hyperstition this, it's you, Robbie. Can you define hyperstition?
Oh, hyperstition is when you're fishing. You put something out there that you want to bring into the world. And sometimes it lands and sometimes it doesn't. Someone else might pick it up and they might run with it. It changes over time, right? It's something that comes out of a scene, out of a group of people that are trying to sense make and figure things out together. And it's something that you can't do by yourself, right? So you kind of just put a meme out there, and then see if someone picks it up. And then if that actually becomes reasonable. It's like playing with the Overton window, something that's crazy that's out there. And then it slowly becomes possible, and then it becomes mainstream.
Yeah. The Regenerative Development Goals, RDGs.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, regenerative, like this is the word we're anchoring to for part of the way it's theming season 1. It just feels like it's in the zeitgeist in so many different places.
And it's not me, right? Like it is a scene. It is the zeitgeist.
Right.
And we all influence each other, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what's special about this community in particular is these are hard challenges. This is world building and world shaping. And we know technology, but we also know people and we know markets, and how can you actually adapt them with intentionality? Yeah.
I know another topic that you've been thinking a lot about is debt swaps for nature. What is this about?
So I think debt swaps for nature are essentially where like a multilateral bank, multinational bank, like the Inter-American Development Bank or the World Bank has given loans to developing countries to build infrastructure. And it's roads, it's power plants, it's agricultural sector, and they have a lot of debt. A sizable amount of the government's annual spending ends up going back to these multinational development banks. And it's really hard to then invest in the new things, in the new economies. And in some cases, some of the debt is actually written down by some of the banks because they don't think that they're going to pay them back, or they can't pay them back. They're in default. So recently, I think TNC, the Nature Conservancy, they've done a couple of these that are awesome. They did one with Barbados, for instance, and they were able to be a broker between the debtor, the country, and the creditor, the bank, to more or less say, "Hey, wipe off that debt and off the bank, and instead, this country will create this national park." And instead of paying the debt service, they will then fund jobs for conservation. So I really, really like that. There's something in there, and there's something in there around how we shift the global economy a bit, where most of the developing countries around the world, the global South, they do have a lot of debt, and it's not just from these development banks, but it's also bilateral, and it's also private. And I think that there's an opportunity to, as we get into, the voluntary markets become more accessible all the way down to local level, and then those transition into more regulations and therefore mandatory markets. There's an opportunity to accelerate that transition by having the global North swap some of their debt for instance, giving land tenure, not just to smallholders and indigenous communities, but even back to nature itself for conservation purposes. So I think that's part of how we shift more toward a regenerative economy. And it's I spend a lot of time in working with governments just in the space community. And that's highly tied to national security as well, right? And there's something that people in the military scholars talk about a great power competition that's happening right now, right, with respect to more authoritative nations and democratic nations, and it is a challenge with respect to these developing countries. And I think it's an opportunity for the West to do some of those swap around debt to accelerate a regenerative economy that then favors more of a market-based approach toward the world and a rules-based international order. And so I think that there's an ingredient to some of the challenges that we have today with authoritative countries and with the liberal democratic nations, where debt swaps are part of it. It's something that nations can do. Right. While we then shape and work on the market side, and voluntary, then make it into mandatory. So it's a key ingredient that I think really needs to be really needs to be leveraged.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that the structure of our global economy as it stands today, there's a lot of debt owed between countries. But a lot of that also is structural, for example, global South owing global North a lot of debt.
Correct.
A lot of times that debt can't be repaid or it's highly burdensome. And yet now that we bring this more ecological lens or this more natural capital lens into the picture, we say, okay, well, Ecuador, you owe all of this money to these global banks or to these other countries, and everyone has an incentive for you not to cut down the Amazon rainforest. And Ecuador is like, well, we have to cut down these trees because we need money to service our debts.
Correct.
Right. And so, okay.
So then an oil company will come in and do subsurface drilling.
Right.
And that's a double whammy to it.
Right. And that money is still going outside, being extracted. So what debt swaps for nature is really about is to say, okay, listen, let's forgive that debt in exchange for the protection and ongoing restoration or management of these bodies of nature.
Exactly. And we can now monitor that.
Create feedback loops through things like Earth data platforms.
For instance.
Yeah. And I think what is so exciting about it, even though it sounds really intimidating, having countries and World Bank agree on these types of arrangements, like one, it feels fairly inaccessible for most of us. And two, there's just constant geopolitical turmoil all of the time. So, how to broker these types of arrangements feels very difficult. But this is where you can move really enormous sums of money.
High leverage.
Right. So yeah, high leverage, and you do one deal and it's just like huge amounts of.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And yeah, for most of us that are building tech and doing that stuff, it seems super inaccessible, but there are a lot of people that are in Washington and all over the place that really, the World Bank mission is to end poverty, not to keep people in subservience. Right. So that's why people go to the World Bank to do that. Mm. The structures that we put in place just has had this unintended consequence, and it definitely needs a rethink. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when we talk about a regenerative economy, it's almost like we need to also think about what structurally do we need to change for our monetary policy, for a rules-based international order to then make sense for the 21st century. And what set that up was when the music stopped after World War II. The Bretton Woods Conference created what we know as the global markets today, right? With the World Bank and IMF and the dollar as a reserve currency. And its objective function at that point in time was get mutual dependence to avoid another world war. Mm-hmm. And largely successful. And then now we've, I don't think it was intentional, but we've created this multiple class global economy, and that's not just. And I think that we have to be thinking about global monetary policy, and while we then think through a regenerative economy at the same time. So it may not be the people in Web3, the people that are developing things on top of an Earth data platform, but it's definitely the economists, and it's definitely the development professionals who've devoted their life to this that also need to fundamentally rethink, what are those new rules for a regenerative economy. And I do think that debt swaps is one of the biggest ways that can really accelerate that transition.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also just add that there's probably a really important role for philanthropy and philanthropic funding, because it can sit outside of a particular nation state affiliation and help to signal and kickstart some of these processes.
Absolutely. Without a doubt, most philanthropy is where there's a market failure. So you can use that for a Band-Aid, which is definitely useful. Mm-hmm. You can also use it almost as like a venture philanthropy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you can be the first money into something, not expecting anything back. In fact, not getting anything back, but into a project that then can have its own sustainable financial model,
Mm-hmm.
where maybe subsidies aren't there yet, or incentives aren't there yet, or a company won't do it by themselves. So I think the role in philanthropy to find these leverage point projects
Mm-hmm.
are critical. And I can tell you, Planet, we benefited from philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
I'll close on one last thing that I'm super excited about is a new satellite that we're building, and this satellite can measure methane emissions at the point source level. And methane is like 20 times more potent than CO2. It's invisible. If you can measure it, if you could see it, you can. I mean, most of it is just like loss of product, right? So people are incentivized to plug a hole or whatever it actually is. And there hasn't really ever been an instrument of this caliber in space before that is unclassified and available for the planet. And so we worked with a couple of individuals that really cared. A guy named Richard Lawrence, who's a philanthropist but also an investor in markets. He did really well for himself, mainly when China was opening up, and also worked with an engineer at JPL named Riley Duran. And for about 2 or 3 years, we came up with a concept where a new nonprofit was created called Carbon Mapper. Their mission is to be the weather service for CO2 and CH4 and release that weather service as a digital public good. And we were able to raise about $120 million into that nonprofit. And then Planet is their partner. We're actually on contract from them to take this world-class instrument out of a national laboratory at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, partner with them to then put that onto one of our satellites, launch it, operate it, and then build a second one, much cheaper, much faster to launch it and operate it. It's a really interesting way of finding it's venture philanthropy, finding an initial amount of money to come in, a leverage point product to create a digital public good for society that then has a sustainable business model. So we own the data. We can license it to our customers, power our Earth data platform. It's not just good for methane, by the way, it's a biodiversity mapper. It has like over 400 different spectral bands, so you can tell the different types of trees and crops and et cetera. Then they get a 10% revenue share. So hopefully one-time investment into this new nonprofit, and then it has a sustainable business model with aligned interests. And the result of it is we are incentivized to not just launch 2, but more, dozens more. And so it really then is part of the whole data suite that then powers this Earth data platform. And so, I just wanted to underscore the fact that philanthropy plays a critical role for doing these higher risk and bolder systemic change projects that then create new economies.
Yeah, I think it's also a testament to not only the creativity of you and your team, but the kind of the trust building across different sectors and the deep partnerships that have helped you all be so successful. I have one more question I want to ask you before we break, which is about New Zealand, a country that we both have grown to love so much. And you've spent some time recently in Aotearoa. Tell me a bit about your experiences there and how you're thinking about the country.
Yeah, so when you travel into different bioregions and different countries, you time travel, sometimes into the future and sometimes into the past, sometimes into the recent past. What I see in New Zealand is a little bit further into the future with respect to a country that was colonized, a country that has a rich culture that was colonized, that see reality and incentive structure differently than we do from the West. And I see the hard work that the Maori and the New Zealanders are doing together in order to kind of bridge those cultures and those worldviews together. I love the rights for nature that's coming out of New Zealand. There's now the third piece of nature that has legal personhood, Mount Taranaki, It's a country that is rich in natural capital. It's a country that historically has an economy that was really tied to the UK economy, and around like dairy and pine, and that is shifting. I think the emission trading scheme that the New Zealand government is doing is an awesome step, best that they can do at that point in time. That had some unintended consequences around actually incentivizing like monocrop pine forestry without actually seeing and valuing native forests and ecosystems. I think the work that the last thing I would say is that it also has sovereign currency, right? So there's quite a bit of monetary policy. There's quite a bit of a petri dish that you can do there to bring different worlds together, to create aligned incentives, to value the natural capital that is that's really there. So that's why I'm excited to spend more time there, is because I think it's further in the future than where I live in California. And California is one of the most forward-leaning environmental governments in the West. I think that there are a number of people that are attracted there. There's something about the land. There's something about what that pulls out of people. Maybe it's being so far away, but and so I would love to do a project there to prototype and test some of these things around a regenerative economy. So that's what attracted me there.
Awesome. Love it.
Yep.
Any final reflections or messages you would like to share?
I think back to the point around, the people that you're interviewing in this podcast series. I can't wait to watch all of them. It's going to be a lot. Is that it really is I like the concept of the genius. It's not an individual person or a genius that actually creates the future. It's deep trust, people who do hard work every day, humbly, boldly, and share and make it interoperable. This is it feels like there will be some breakthrough opportunities that actually point to bring that vision of the future of a regenerative future closer to home, and that comes from a group of people who are doing their best work in their life, having fun with it, being humble with it, learning from one another, experimenting, and then knowing how to turn that into what should become a utility of a building block for this century. So thank you for doing this, and I can't wait to watch all of them.
Robbie Shingler, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew.
All right, what'd you think? To engage in this discussion further, I invite you to join our community Discord. To learn more about Planet Labs, go to planet.com. You may also want to check out the conversations we had with Will Marshall and Tara O'Shea, both of Planet as well. There's links in the show notes. All of these conversations and more can be found at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.